Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to wake before the sun rises, not by choice, but by necessity? To begin each day in darkness, your breath visible in the cold air, knowing that 14 hours of labor stretch ahead before you can rest again? Picture this. London, 1870. Gas lamps flicker against rain-slicked cobblestones. Behind the gleaming facades of Mayfair's grand townhouses, another world exists entirely, one of narrow back stairs, coal-blackened hands, and footsteps that must never echo in the wrong hallway. Tonight, we're going to drift back to that forgotten world, where comfort was a luxury reserved for others, and dignity was found in the quiet rhythm of endless invisible work. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Close your eyes and let yourself sink back into the shadows of gaslight and coal smoke, where lives were lived in service to others' dreams. The wooden floor beneath your feet is cold, even through the thin wool stockings that have been darned and redarned until the original fabric is barely visible. It's 4:30 in the morning, and the narrow attic room you share with two other servants feels like the inside of an ice house. Your breath forms small clouds that dissipate quickly in the stale air, which carries the mingled scents of damp wool, yesterday's carbolic soap, and the faint, ever-present temps of coal smoke that seeps through every crack in this great house. The thin blanket you've just pushed aside offered little warmth through the night. Beneath it, you wore your chemise and an old woolen petticoat. Removing them would have meant waking to air so cold it felt like needles against your skin. Around you, the other servants stir. Mary, the scullery maid, has already risen and is feeling her way carefully toward the door, her bare feet making the softest whisper against the floorboards. Agnes, the upper housemaid, turns over with a small sigh, claiming another precious few minutes of rest that her higher position in the household hierarchy affords her. But you are the between maid, neither the lowest nor anywhere near the highest. Your day begins now, in this pre-dawn darkness, with the lighting of the fires. Imagine yourself moving carefully down the narrow back stairs, one hand trailing along the rough plaster wall for guidance. These stairs are steep and uneven, worn smooth by decades of servants' feet. There are no gas jets here in the servants' passages. Candles and oil lamps must suffice, and even those are used sparingly. The darkness presses around you like a living thing, broken only by the faint gray light that seeps through a small window at the landing. Your first destination is the kitchen range, where the banked coals from last night still hold a dim red glow. The air here is warmer, but it carries the weight of yesterday's cooking, ghost scents of mutton and onions, the lingering heaviness of flour and steam. Your hands, already roughened by months of this work, move with practiced efficiency as you coax the coals back to life. Adding kindling piece by piece until small flames begin to dance. The coal scuttle is heavy, and your arms strain as you carry it up the back stairs to the family's rooms. Each fireplace must be laid and lit before the household stairs. The drawing room, the dining room, the library, the morning room, and each of the family bedrooms. The grates are cold and often filled with yesterday's ash, which must be cleared away with small brushes and dustpans, soot inevitably finding its way under your fingernails and into the creases of your palms. As you kneel before each fireplace, the marble hearth cold against your knees through your wool skirts, you build the fires with methodical care. Paper first, then kindling arranged just so, then the precious coal placed with an economy born of necessity. Each fire must catch cleanly. There's no tolerance for rooms filled with smoke or fires that die before the family wakes. The repetitive motion becomes almost meditative. Sweep, lay light, move on. Sweep, lay light, move on. Your knees grow sore from kneeling on hard surfaces, and your back begins to ache from the constant bending and rising. But there's a quiet satisfaction in watching each flame take hold, knowing that when the family descends to their breakfast, warmth will greet them like an invisible servant they'll never think to thank. Between the fires, you must begin the water hauling. The house boasts some modern conveniences, gas lighting in the main rooms, and even a water closet on the first floor. But most of the water for washing must still be carried by hand. Heavy ewers filled with cold water must make their way up the main stairs to the family bedrooms, where they'll be warmed with water heated in the kitchen and poured into fine china basins. Your arms burn from the weight, and you must stop frequently on the stairs to rest, always listening for the sounds of the family stirring. If any member of the household should see you on the main stairs, it would mean a sharp reprimand from Mrs. Hartwell. The housekeeper, whose pale eyes seem to see everything, and whose voice, though quiet, carries the weight of absolute authority. By 6 o'clock, you've earned a brief respite for your own breakfast. In the servants' hall, a long, narrow room below, stairs with whitewashed walls and a scrubbed wooden table. You join the others for a meal that seems almost luxurious after hours of work in the cold. Porridge with a little milk, bread with a scraping of butter, and tea that's been brewing in a massive brown pot since before dawn. The conversation is quiet and practical. Mary mentions that the scullery drain is backing up again. Agnes reminds everyone that the family is expecting dinner guests tomorrow, which means extra silver to polish and floors to scrub. Mr. Jameson, the butler, a thin, serious man in his 50s, whose black coat is always immaculate, reviews the day's tasks with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. You eat quickly, aware that every moment of rest is borrowed time. The bread is coarse but filling, and the tea, though weak, provides a brief warmth that spreads through your chest. Around the table, the other servants eat with the same focused efficiency, their faces bearing the particular wariness that comes from lives lived always in service to other schedules. After breakfast, the real work begins. Your hands already reddened from the cold and the coal dust must now tackle the endless cleaning that keeps this house running. The brass fittings throughout the house, door handles, fire irons, candle holders, and the elaborate gas fixtures must be polished until they shine like mirrors. The polish smells sharp and chemical, and it stains your fingers a dull brown that no amount of scrubbing seems to entirely remove. Each piece must be removed, cleaned, and replaced with careful precision. The brass polish requires vigorous rubbing with soft cloths, and your arms soon ache from the repetitive motion. But there's no rushing this work. Mrs. Hartwell will inspect each piece with the thoroughness of a jeweler examining precious stones, and any smudge or dullness will mean doing the work over again. The silver presents an even greater challenge. The family's tea service, serving platters, and ornate cutlery must be cleaned with a paste that smells of sulfur and leaves your hands dry and cracked. Each fork must be polished between its tines, each spoon buffed until it reflects your face like a mirror. The work is tedious and meticulous, requiring a delicate touch that seems almost impossible when your hands are numb with cold and roughened by constant work. Between the metalwork, there are floors to scrub. Not the fine parquet and turkey carpets of the family's rooms, but the stone floors of the kitchen, the servants' hall, and the back passages that are the hidden arteries of this house. You work on your hands and knees, scrubbing with brushes and harsh soap that makes your skin sting. The rhythmic motion of scrubbing becomes almost hypnotic, forward and back, forward and back. Working your way across the stones that generations of servants have worn smooth with their labor, the laundry presents its own challenges. The family's fine linens and clothing require careful washing in water heated over the kitchen fire. Your hands become raw from the lye soap and the hot water, and the constant moisture leaves them chapped and painful. Each garment must be treated with reverence due to its cost. A single mistake could mean replacing an item worth more than your yearly wages. As the day progresses, the hierarchy of the household becomes as fixed and immutable as the stones of the foundation. You speak when spoken to, keep your eyes downcast when any member of the family passes, and move through the house like a shadow, present but invisible. Your opinions, your thoughts, your very presence as a human being seem to fade into the background hum of the household's daily operations. The work never truly ends. It simply shifts from one task to another. After the morning's fires and cleaning comes the preparation for the family's luncheon. Then the afternoon's mending and organizing, then the evening's service and cleanup. At your feet in shoes that have been resoled twice and will soon need resoling again. Carry you up and down the stairs dozens of times each day. The narrow back stairs become as familiar as your own heartbeat, their creaks and groans a soundtrack to your constant movement. Dinner service brings its own particular stresses. The family's meal must be served with military precision, each course timed perfectly. Each dish at the proper temperature, each piece of silver gleaming under the gaslight. You stand in the pantry between courses, listening to the muffled conversation from the dining room, aware that your work has made their leisure possible, but knowing that your contribution will never be acknowledged. As evening deepens, the family retreats to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, but your work continues. Dishes must be washed, floors swept, preparations made for tomorrow's early start. The kitchen, which was bustling with activity during dinner preparation, gradually empties as the other servants finish their tasks and climb the back stairs to their rooms. Finally, near 10 o'clock, you climb those narrow stairs yourself. Your legs feel leaden, and your back aches from the day's constant bending and lifting. The attic room, which felt so cold this morning, now seems almost welcoming. You undress in the darkness, careful not to wake Mary and Agnes, and slip under the thin blanket that will provide inadequate warmth until morning. As you lie there listening to the house settle around you, you can hear the faint sounds of the family's evening, voices from the drawing room, the soft closing of doors, footsteps on the main stairs as they retire to bedrooms warmed by fires you lit before dawn. Their day is ending in comfort and leisure, but yours will begin again in just a few hours, when the darkness outside the small attic window will still be absolute and the cold will cut through your thin clothing like a blade. The rhythm of their days was not their own, but belonged entirely to others. In just a few hours, you will rise again to begin the same cycle. Fires, water, cleaning, service, that defines not just your working life, but your very existence within these walls, as the gentle rhythm of one servant's daily toil fades into the quiet corners of memory. Let us drift toward another story, one that lived and breathed through the same corridors of service, but stretched across decades of change and quiet determination. Her name was Margaret Powell, and though she was born in 1907, her early years in domestic service carried the echoes of that earlier Victorian world we've just visited, like the lingering scent of coal smoke and fabric long after the fire has died. Picture, if you will, a young girl of 15, standing at the servants' entrance of a grand house in the countryside outside London. The year is 1922, and the morning mist clings to the carefully manicured grounds like a veil between worlds. The servants' entrance, a plain wooden door, painted the same serviceable green as the garden gates, stands in stark contrast to the grand marble steps and carved oak doors that welcome the family and their guests. Here, at this humble threshold, begins a journey that will span decades and transform not just one young woman's life, but illuminate the experiences of countless others who lived in the shadows of privilege. Margaret's small cloth bag contains everything she owns: a spare dress carefully mended by her mother's hands, undergarments darned with stitches so small they speak of hours spent by lamplight, a prayer book whose leather cover has been worn smooth by countless fingers, and a photograph of her family that she will keep hidden in whatever small space becomes hers. The photograph, taken at a studio in Brighton, shows her parents and siblings arranged with the formal stiffness that cameras demanded in those days. But their eyes hold the warmth and worry that no amount of photographic formality could disguise. She had grown up in Hove, that genteel companion to Brighton, where the salt air mixed with the smoke from Brighton's chimneys, creating that particular scent of English coastal life, briny and industrial, hopeful and melancholy all at once. The streets of her childhood were narrow and crowded, lined with houses that leaned against each other like tired friends. Her father worked when he could find it, his calloused hands equally at home with dock work, construction, or any other labor that paid enough to keep the family fed. Her mother took in washing, her days spent bent over tubs of scalding water, her fingers perpetually reddened and wrinkled from the harsh soaps and constant moisture. Margaret herself had left school at 13, not from lack of ability, but from the inexorable mathematics of poverty. Every child in families like hers reached a moment when their potential contribution to the household's survival outweighed the luxury of further education. She had shown promise in her studies. Her teacher, Miss Williams, had spoken hopefully of scholarships and opportunities. But these possibilities seemed as distant as the stars when weighed against the immediate need for another wage earner in the family. Domestic service wasn't chosen so much as it chose her, one of the few respectable paths available to a girl from her background, offering food, shelter, and the promise of learning skills that might someday lead to something more. The agency that arranged her placement had been a small room above a tailor's shop, smelling of thread and pressing irons, where women in worn but clean clothes waited nervously for interviews that would determine their immediate futures. Margaret had waited her turn, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the murmur of voices from behind the partition where other girls were being assessed. Their qualifications weighed, their characters evaluated by strangers who would never know their dreams or fears. The kitchen where Margaret first worked stretched along the basement of the house like a cavern carved from purpose and necessity. The great range dominated one wall, its iron surface blackened by years of constant use, radiating heat that made the summer months almost unbearable and provided the only warmth during the bitter winter days when frost formed patterns on the small windows that provided the only natural light. The range was a temperamental beast that required constant attention, coal to be added at precise intervals, dampers to be adjusted with the skill of a ship's engineer, fires to be banked at night and coaxed back to life before dawn. Cast iron pots hung from hooks along the walls like the tools in a blacksmith's forge, their bottoms darkened by decades of fire. Each one seasoned by countless meals prepared for people Margaret would rarely see and never speak to unless spoken to first. The largest of these pots could hold soup for 20 people, their weight when full, requiring 2 strong servants to lift. The smallest were delicate things designed for sauces and reductions, their copper bottoms polished to mirror brightness despite their utilitarian purpose. The kitchen walls were whitewashed stone, practical and easy to clean, but they absorbed the sounds of constant activity, the chopping of vegetables, the sizzling of meat in pans, the bubbling of stocks and stews, the sharp commands of the cook orchestrating the daily symphony of meal preparation. Shelves lined every available wall space, holding the arsenal of ingredients and implements required to feed a household of 20 people with the standards of cuisine that wealth demanded. As the lowest member of the kitchen staff, Margaret's domain was the scullery, a narrow room adjacent to the main kitchen where the endless washing up took place. The scullery was perhaps the humblest space in the entire house, its purpose purely functional, its atmosphere thick with steam and the smell of harsh soap. Here, in water heated over the fire and carried by hand in heavy buckets, she scrubbed pots whose bottoms were caked with the remnants of elaborate meals, caramelized sugars from desserts, congealed fats from roasts, the stubborn residue of sauces that had taken hours to prepare and minutes to consume. Her hands, soft when she'd arrived from her mother's careful tending, quickly became reddened and rough from the harsh soap and constant immersion in water that was either scalding hot or numbingly cold. The soap itself was a brutal thing, made from lye and animal fats, designed for effectiveness rather than gentleness. It stripped away not just grease and food particles, but layers of skin, leaving her hands perpetually raw during her first months of service. She learned to rub them with drippings from the roasting pans when no one was watching, the animal fat providing some protection against the constant assault of water and caustic cleaners. The cook, Mrs. Bradshaw, ruled this underground kingdom with the absolute authority of long experience and fierce pride in her craft. She was a woman in her 50s whose gray hair was always pinned, severely back under a white cap that marked her status as surely as any crown. Her aproned figure moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to orchestrate complex meals with military precision, every movement economical, every gesture purposeful. She had been in service since she was younger than Margaret, working her way up through the rigid hierarchy of kitchen staff with a combination of skill, determination, and the particular kind of intelligence that domestic service both required and developed. Her voice, when she spoke to Margaret, carried the weight of someone who had once stood where Margaret now stood, scrubbing pots in the scullery while dreaming of advancement. But it also carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to command rather than serve, who had achieved a position of respect and responsibility within the narrow confines available to someone of her background. She was not unkind, but neither was she gentle. Kindness was a luxury that busy kitchens could rarely afford. And gentleness might be mistaken for weakness in a position that required absolute control. "Mind that China girl," Mrs. Bradshaw would say, not unkindly, but with the firmness of someone who knew that broken dishes meant explanations to the housekeeper. And explanations to the housekeeper were to be avoided at all costs. Those plates cost more than you'll earn in a month, and don't you forget it. The china in question was often Spode or Worcester, decorated with hand-painted patterns that represented hours of skilled artistry. Each piece worth more than Margaret's family spent on food in a week. Margaret's days began in darkness, just as they had for generations of servants before her. The small alarm clock on the table between her bed and those of the other kitchen maids, a tin-plated timepiece whose loud ticking marked the rhythm of their shared sleep, would sound at 5 o'clock, its harsh ringing cutting through dreams of home and family like a knife through pastry. The sound was designed to wake without regard for comfort, a mechanical summons that tolerated no negotiation, no plea for additional rest. She would dress quickly in the pre-dawn chill, her breath visible in the unheated servants' quarters, pulling on the rough wool stockings that her mother had knitted during the long evenings, the practical cotton dress that marked her station, and the apron that would bear the stains and splashes of the day's work. The apron was both protection and uniform, white cotton that showed every mark but could be boiled clean, practical pockets for the small tools of her trade, ties that cinched her waist in a way that was both modest and functional. The servants' quarters occupied the very top of the house. Under the eaves where the roof slanted sharply and summer heat collected like a physical weight. In winter, frost would form on the inside of the small windows. Margaret would wake to find ice in the water pitcher that served the 3 girls who shared the narrow room. The beds were simple iron frames with thin mattresses stuffed with horsehair, practical but hardly comfortable, designed for sleep rather than rest. The kitchen in those early morning hours held a different quality of silence than the rest of the house. It was not the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the expectant hush of a space waiting to burst into activity. Margaret would light the oil lamps with matches kept in a tin box by the range, their flames casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls, creating a warm circle of light in the pre-dawn darkness. The transition from the cold, dark morning to the lamplit kitchen was like entering another world. Moving from the harsh reality of winter into a space dedicated to warmth and sustenance. The range itself required careful tending, coal to be added in precisely the right amounts, drafts to be adjusted with the sensitivity of a musician tuning an instrument, the fire maintained at the precise temperature needed for the day's cooking. Too hot and delicate sauces would curdle, to cool, and bread would fail to rise properly. Mrs. Bradshaw had trained Margaret to read the range's moods like a farmer reads weather, understanding the subtle signs that indicated when adjustment was needed, when patience was required, when immediate action was essential. Her first task was always the cleaning of the previous evening's pots and pans left soaking overnight in the great stone sink that dominated one wall of the scullery. The grease had congealed in the cool night air, forming a white film on the water's surface that had to be skimmed away before the real work could begin. This skimming was an art in itself, too aggressive, and the grease would simply disperse through the water, making everything more difficult to clean, to gentle, and the process would take forever. Each pot required individual attention and technique. The roasting pans, blackened with the concentrated residue of meat and vegetables, had to be scraped clean with knives specially designed for the purpose, their blades angled to reach into corners where grease loved to hide. The saucepans, with their layers of reduced stocks and delicate preparations, required scrubbing with brushes made from pig bristles, each brush selected for its stiffness and durability. The delicate china serving dishes had to be washed with the reverence, due to objects worth more than most people's yearly wages, each piece handled as if it were made of spun glass. Between the washing up, Margaret performed dozens of other tasks that formed the invisible foundation of the household's comfort. Vegetables arrived from the garden covered in earth that told the story of their growth, rich, dark soil clinging to potatoes, sandy loam dusting the carrots, clay earth embedding itself in the creases of cabbages. These vegetables had to be cleaned with a thoroughness that removed not just dirt but any trace of their humble origins, transformed from products of the earth into ingredients worthy of refined cuisine. Potatoes came by the bushel and had to be scrubbed clean of soil, their eyes removed with the precision of a surgeon, their skins peeled in continuous strips that fell into buckets for the pig slop. The repetitive motion of peeling became almost meditative, the rhythmic scrape of knife against skin, the steady accumulation of clean, white vegetables ready for cooking, the satisfaction of transforming the rough into the refined. Carrots required scraping with knives designed specifically for the purpose, their orange skins coming away in delicate curls that Margaret learned to make as thin as paper. Onions were perhaps the most challenging, layers of papery skin that clung stubbornly, followed by the actual peeling that brought tears streaming down her cheeks. No matter how many techniques she tried to avoid them, she learned to work near the open window when possible, to breathe through her mouth, to keep a damp cloth nearby to wipe her eyes. But the tears were simply part of the job, as inevitable as the ache in her back from bending over preparation tables. Root vegetables came by the basketful during autumn and winter months, and her hands became permanently stained with the earth and juice of the produce she prepared for others' meals. Turnips, parsnips, swedes, and beets all required their own techniques, their own tools, their own understanding of how to transform them from garden produce into kitchen ingredients. Her fingernails, despite constant scrubbing, bore the evidence of her work, darkened with soil that seemed to embed itself permanently, stained with vegetable juices that no amount of soap could completely remove. The actual cooking was beyond her station, but she watched Mrs. Bradshaw work with the fascination of someone observing high artistry. The cook's hands moved with practiced confidence as she prepared elaborate dishes whose names Margaret was only just learning. Clear turtle soup that required days of preparation, raised pork pies with intricate pastry work, syllabub that had to be whipped to exactly the right consistency, and charlotte rusk that demanded precision in every component. These were foods from another world, containing ingredients that Margaret had never tasted and might never taste. Turtle soup required an actual turtle, shipped live from distant waters and dispatched in the kitchen with a ceremony that seemed both magnificent and slightly barbaric. The pork pies contained not just pork but veal, ham, and exotic seasonings that came from spice merchants in London. Their costs carefully calculated and recorded in the household's account books. Her own meals were simple and practical: porridge made from oats grown on English farms, bread baked from flour that bore no resemblance to the delicate pastries produced for the family's table, occasional bacon when the household budget allowed, vegetables from the garden prepared without the elaborate sauces that graced the upstairs dining room. This was nourishing but plain fare that reflected her position in the household's hierarchy. Designed to sustain rather than delight, to provide energy for work rather than pleasure and consumption, the rigid structure of that hierarchy governed every aspect of Margaret's existence within those walls. She spoke to Mrs. Bradshaw when addressed, responding with the deference that her position demanded, always conscious that her words were being evaluated not just for their content, but for their appropriateness. To the other kitchen maids, she could speak more freely, but even then, in whispers during brief moments of shared work. Always aware that voices could carry, that ears were listening, that the wrong word at the wrong time could have consequences. The upper servants, the butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, and valet, occupied a different stratum entirely, their authority over Margaret as absolute as the family's authority over them. The butler was a figure of remote dignity, who occasionally descended to the kitchen to discuss menus or wine selection with Mrs. Bradshaw, his presence transforming the atmosphere of the entire space. When he appeared, conversations ceased, postures straightened, and everyone became acutely aware of their position in the household's complex social structure. The housekeeper was even more distant, a woman whose approval meant security and whose displeasure could mean dismissal, her keys jangling from her belt in a constant reminder of her authority over stores, supplies, and the domestic arrangements that kept the household functioning. Her quarterly meetings with the kitchen staff were formal affairs where accounts were reviewed, performance evaluated, and expectations reinforced with the precision of military briefings. Margaret learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the mood of the household above stairs, developing a sensitivity to atmospheric changes that bordered on the supernatural. When the family entertained, the pace in the kitchen intensified to near frenzy. With additional courses to prepare, special dietary requirements to accommodate, and the pressure of knowing that the family's social reputation depended partly on the quality of the meals served to their guests, when there had been unpleasantness, a business disappointment for the master, social embarrassment for the mistress, family disagreements that created tension, the atmosphere throughout the house became charged with unspoken anxiety that trickled down through the servants. Hierarchy like water through stone. The family's moods affected every level of the household, from the butler's increased formality to the cook's shortened temper to Margaret's own heightened awareness of every potential mistake. During the London season, the entire household would shift its rhythms to accommodate the family's social obligations. Late dinners meant later preparation, which meant longer days for everyone in the kitchen. Multiple course meals became routine, each requiring different preparations, different timing, different levels of skill and coordination. The pressure during these periods was intense, with no tolerance for error and no allowance for the fatigue that accumulated over weeks of extended hours. The work was relentless, but it was not without its small pleasures and moments of human connection that made the isolation of service life bearable. Alice, one of the other kitchen maids, had been in service for 3 years and took Margaret under her wing with the generosity of someone who remembered her own bewildered first days. Alice was 2 years older than Margaret, but her experience in service made her seem much more mature, more confident, more aware of the unwritten rules that governed their shared existence. During the brief respites between meals, usually no more than 30 minutes when the morning's work was finished and the afternoons had not yet begun, Alice would share the gossip that circulated through the servants' quarters like a hidden newspaper. News of other households, stories of servants who had bettered themselves, whispered speculation about the private lives of their employers, information about wages and conditions at other houses, rumors of positions opening that might represent opportunities for advancement. "The thing is," Alice would say as they sat in the servants' hall during their brief afternoon break, their hands wrapped around thick pottery mugs of tea that was stronger and more bitter than anything served upstairs. "You've got to remember this isn't forever. Some girls, they get comfortable with the steady meals and the roof over their heads, and they forget to keep looking ahead. But service is what you do, not who you are." These conversations took place in the servants' hall, a long, narrow room with whitewashed walls and a deal table scrubbed white from years of meals and cleaning. The room was strictly functional, containing no decoration beyond a few religious prints and a photograph of the late Queen Victoria, their frames simple and unadorned. Here, the rigid hierarchy of the house relaxed slightly, though never completely disappeared. The upper servants still sat at the head of the table, still commanded respect and deference, but there was room for conversation, for shared laughter, for the kind of human connection that made the isolation of service life bearable. Margaret began to understand that service created its own culture, its own network of relationships and loyalties that existed parallel to but separate from the world of their employers. Servants moved between households like actors changing companies, carrying with them news, techniques, and connections that formed an invisible web spanning the entire servant population. A good reference from one household could open doors to better positions. A reputation for reliability or particular skills could lead to advancement within the rigid structure of domestic hierarchy. This servant network operated like an informal employment agency, with information about available positions, difficult employers, generous households, and opportunities for advancement passed through informal conversations and chance meetings. Former colleagues who had moved to other houses would maintain contact, sharing information that could prove invaluable to those still working their way up through the system. The network also provided emotional support, sense of shared identity, and common experience that helped individuals maintain their dignity and sense of self-worth despite the constraints of their positions. The physical demands of the work shaped Margaret's body as surely as a sculptor shapes clay, but the changes were gradual, almost imperceptible from day to day. Her arms grew strong from lifting heavy pots and carrying trays loaded with dishes. Her shoulders broadened from the constant reaching and stretching required by her tasks. Her back straightened from years of standing at sinks and preparation tables, developing the kind of posture that came not from deportment lessons, but from practical necessity. Her hands, once soft and pale like her mother's had been before years of washing, came strong and capable, marked by small scars from knives and burns from hot metal, but infinitely more skilled than when she'd arrived. She learned to judge temperature by touch, to test the doneness of vegetables with a knife point, to handle delicate pastry without destroying its texture. Her fingers developed their own intelligence, able to distinguish between different grades of flour, to detect the subtle differences in the ripeness of fruit, to gauge the consistency of sauces by their resistance to stirring. But it was perhaps the mental and emotional adaptations that marked the deepest changes, transformations that went to the very core of how Margaret understood herself and her place in the world. She learned to make herself invisible when necessary, to move through spaces without drawing attention, to complete tasks without acknowledgement or praise. This invisibility was not just physical, but psychological. The ability to be present without imposing her own personality or preferences on the situation. She developed what she would later describe as servant's ears. the ability to appear completely focused on her work while actually listening to conversations, gathering information that might be useful or important, understanding the undercurrents of household politics that could affect her position. This selective attention was a survival skill, allowing her to navigate the complex social dynamics of the household, while maintaining the appearance of complete dedication to her duties. The uniform she wore, the simple gray dress, white apron, and cap, became like a second skin, marking her position in the world as clearly as if she carried a sign. The dress was made of sturdy cotton designed to withstand constant washing, its color chosen to hide stains and show respectability. The apron was crisp white cotton that had to be changed whenever it became soiled, its cleanliness a reflection of her competence and attention to detail. The cap was perhaps the most symbolic element, marking her as a servant as clearly as any badge of office, but also providing practical protection for her hair in the steamy, greasy environment of the kitchen. But Margaret began to understand that the uniform was also a kind of camouflage, allowing her to move through spaces and observe lives that would otherwise have been completely closed to someone of her background. She saw wealth up close, observed the daily routines of privilege, witnessed conversations and behaviors that revealed the character of those she served. She began to develop her own quiet judgments about the fairness of a world, where some people's comfort depended entirely on others' labor, where accident of birth determined not just material circumstances, but opportunities for fulfillment and self-expression. During her rare free time, usually a few hours on Sunday afternoons, when the household relaxed its rigid schedule, Margaret would walk in the countryside around the house, breathing air that didn't smell of coal, smoke, and cooking, letting her eyes rest on horizons that weren't bounded by kitchen walls. These walks became precious to her, moments when she could remember who she was, beyond her function as a servant, when she could dream about a different kind of life, when she could imagine futures that extended beyond the narrow confines of domestic service. The countryside offered a different perspective on the house where she worked, allowing her to see it as others saw it. An impressive mansion set in carefully landscaped grounds, representing wealth, stability, and social position. From the outside, it appeared as a symbol of English prosperity and good taste. But Margaret knew its hidden infrastructure, understood the army of workers required to maintain its appearance of effortless elegance, recognized the human cost of the comfort it provided to its owners. She began to keep a small diary, hidden in her trunk beneath her spare undergarments, where she recorded not just the events of her days, but her observations about the world she was living in. Her writing, self-taught and unpracticed, nevertheless captured the texture of service life with remarkable clarity. She wrote about the ache in her feet after 14-hour days, about the satisfaction of mastering a difficult task, about the homesickness that could strike her without warning during the quiet moments between duties. Sometimes, she wrote in one entry, her careful handwriting filling the small pages of a notebook purchased with carefully saved pennies. I feel like I'm watching two different plays happening at the same time. There's the life upstairs with its dinner parties and afternoon calls and talk about politics and travel. And there's the life downstairs with its early mornings and aching backs and talk about wages and days off. The strange thing is, neither play makes complete sense without the other. But the people upstairs never think about the people downstairs, while we always have to think about them. As months turned into years, Margaret began to understand that service was not just a job, but a complete way of life that shaped every aspect of daily existence. The rhythm of the household became her rhythm, her body clock adjusting to its demands, her emotional life organized around its requirements. The seasons were marked not by changes in weather, but by changes in the social calendar that determined the intensity of work. Spring meant the families moved to London for the season. Summer meant house parties and entertaining. Autumn meant preservation and preparation. Winter meant the quiet months when the household turned inward. She learned to find dignity in work that others might have found degrading, discovering that there was genuine pride to be taken in perfectly cleaned silver and vegetables cut with mathematical precision. In the smooth operation of a complex household that depended on her skills and reliability, she began to understand that her labor, though invisible to those who benefited from it, was skilled and valuable, requiring intelligence, physical strength, and emotional resilience that not everyone possessed. But she also began to dream of something beyond service, to imagine a life where her intelligence and capabilities could be applied to her own benefit rather than others. It's the money she earned, small as it was by any reasonable standard, began to accumulate in a small bank account opened in the nearest town. The bank was an intimidating place to someone of her background, but she forced herself to overcome her nervousness, understanding that financial independence was the only path to freedom. She saved with the determination of someone who understood that every penny represented not just money, but possibility. Every shilling not spent on necessities went toward a future that she couldn't yet clearly envision, but knew would be different from her present. She calculated carefully, balancing the immediate pleasures that small purchases might bring against the long-term goal of accumulating enough money to make choices about her life. The relationships she formed with other servants became a kind of chosen family, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding that outsiders could never fully comprehend. When one of the kitchen maids left to get married, a rare and enviable escape from service, Margaret felt the loss as keenly as if she'd been a sister. The departure meant not just the loss of companionship, but the disruption of carefully established routines and relationships that had made their shared life bearable. When a new girl arrived, frightened and homesick as Margaret herself had been, she remembered Alice's kindness and passed it forward, offering the same gentle guidance and practical advice that had helped her survive her own early days. This mentoring became one of the most satisfying aspects of her position, allowing her to use her experience to help others navigate the complex world of domestic service with greater confidence and skill. As her confidence grew, so did her awareness of the world beyond the walls of the house where she worked. She began to read newspapers when she could find them, often discovering discarded copies in the servants' hall, or borrowing them from other households during her rare excursions to town. She learned to listen more carefully to the conversations of the upper servants, who had more contact with the outside world, gleaning information about changes happening in society that might eventually affect her own opportunities. She heard about changes that seemed revolutionary to someone of her background. Women gaining the right to vote, new opportunities opening in factories and offices, the slow erosion of the old certainties that had governed English life for generations. These changes seemed distant from her daily reality, but they sparked her imagination and fed her growing conviction that the world was changing in ways that might eventually create opportunities for people like her. The Great War had ended just before she entered service. Its effects continued to ripple through even the most traditional households. Some of the young men who might have gone into service had died in France or returned changed by their experiences. Unwilling or unable to accept the old patterns of deference and subordination, some of the young women who might have been content with domestic work had discovered other possibilities during the war years, working in factories or offices, and developing skills and expectations that made them less willing to accept the constraints of traditional service. The rigid social structure that had seemed as permanent as stone was beginning to show cracks. And through those cracks, people like Margaret began to glimpse possibilities their parents never could have imagined. The changes were subtle and gradual, but to someone with Margaret's intelligence and ambition, they suggested that the future might hold opportunities that the present seemed to deny. Eventually, several years in service that had transformed her from a frightened girl into a capable young woman, Margaret made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She gave her notice, a formal process that required careful timing and diplomatic phrasing to ensure she left with the good references that would be essential for whatever came next. She packed her small belongings into the same cloth bag she'd carried when she arrived, but now it contained not just her possessions but her savings, her hard-won experience, and her carefully preserved sense of self-worth. She left domestic service forever, walking away from the only adult life she had known toward possibilities that existed more in hope than in certainty. She married a man who saw in her the strength and capability that service had developed, who recognized her intelligence and respected her dreams of building a different kind of life. Together, they created a household where her labor benefited her own family rather than strangers, where her skills and intelligence could flourish without the constraints of others' expectations and social hierarchies. Years later, she would write about her experiences in service, creating a record of a way of life that was already disappearing when she lived it. Her memoir captured not just the hardships and indignities of service, but also the human connections, the small triumphs, the quiet strength that developed in people who learned to find dignity in serving others. and the resilience required to maintain hope and ambition under circumstances designed to diminish both. Her story reminds us that behind every comfortable life, there were other lives. Lives lived in service, in shadow, in the spaces between comfort and necessity. Margaret Powell's journey from frightened 15-year-old kitchen made too confident woman who claimed her own life serves as a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even under circumstances designed to diminish it, and to the power of individual determination to transcend the limitations imposed by birth and social circumstance. As we let her story settle into the quiet corners of memory, carry with us the understanding that history is made not just by the famous and powerful, but by the countless individuals who live their lives with dignity and purpose, even when that purpose was defined by others' needs rather than their own dreams. Margaret Powell's legacy lies not just in her individual triumph, but in her witness to a vanished world, and her testimony to the human capacity for growth, adaptation, and ultimately transformation. As Margaret Powell's story fades gently into the quiet archive of memory, let us drift deeper into the very walls that surrounded such lives. Walls that held secrets, passages that whispered with the echoes of countless footsteps, and architectural mysteries that speak to something profound about the Victorian desire to make the essential invisible. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a grand Victorian mansion today. Your footsteps echoing on polished marble floors, your gaze drawn upward to ornate plaster ceilings and crystal chandeliers. The afternoon light streams through tall windows draped in heavy velvet, casting patterns across Persian carpets that cost more than most families earned in a year. But now, imagine that same house revealing its hidden anatomy, secret doors sliding open in what appeared to be solid walls, narrow staircases materializing behind false panels, entire corridors becoming visible that were designed never to be seen by the house's inhabitants. This is the world we're about to explore. The shadow architecture of Victorian domestic life, where engineering met psychology, where practical necessity became almost mystical in its complexity. It's a world where architects spent as much thought on concealment as revelation, where the most sophisticated technology of the age was employed not to impress visitors, but to render human labor invisible. Here, in these forgotten spaces, we find the true blueprint of Victorian society. Not in its grand public faces, but in its careful choreography of human invisibility. Picture, if you will, the drawing room of a wealthy London townhouse in 1875. Gas chandeliers cast their warm light over silk wallpaper imported from France, their patterns telling stories of exotic gardens and mythical birds. Persian carpets cushion every footstep, their deep blues and crimsons creating an atmosphere of cultivated luxury. Family members and guests recline on horsehair sofas upholstered in the finest damask, perhaps discussing the latest exhibition at the Royal Academy or debating the merits of Disraeli's policies. The conversation flows as smoothly as the tea poured from delicate spode china, and the atmosphere suggests a world of perfect ease and refinement. The gentleman of the house might be examining a first edition of Tennyson's latest work, while his wife embroiders an intricate pattern on silk, her needle catching the gaslight as it moves through fabric that shimmer like captured moonlight. Their daughter, fresh from finishing school, plays Chopin on a Broadwood piano, whose mahogany case reflects the room's golden glow. Every detail speaks of taste, wealth, and leisure, a world where beauty and comfort exist in perfect, effortless harmony. But watch more carefully, and you might notice something curious. A fire burns brightly in the marble fireplace, though no one has been seen tending it. The coals glow with perfect consistency, never diminishing, never requiring the crude interruption of human hands adding fuel. Fresh flowers have appeared in crystal vases, hothouse roses in February, exotic orchids that must have traveled from distant conservatories. Though no servant has entered through the main door, the tea service arrived as if by magic, complete with delicate sandwiches cut into perfect triangles and cakes that must have required hours of preparation. And when the guests move to the dining room for dinner, the drawing room will be restored to perfect order without anyone witnessing the transformation. This seamless comfort was achieved through an elaborate network of hidden passages, concealed doors, and acoustic engineering that represented one of the most sophisticated domestic technologies of the Victorian age. Behind the elegant facade of every grand house lay what amounted to a second building, shadow structure designed specifically for the movement of servants and the invisibility of labor. It was architecture as illusion, engineering as magic trick, construction as moral statement about who deserved to be seen and who must remain hidden. The planning of such houses began with what architects called service mapping, detailed studies of every task required to maintain the desired standard of living. Teams of designers would spend months observing existing households, timing servants' movements, calculating loads carried up and down stairs, measuring the space required for different activities. They mapped the flow of labor through houses like hydraulic engineers mapping the flow of water through complex pipe systems, understanding that human efficiency was just as subject to scientific analysis as mechanical efficiency. Let us trace our way through one of these hidden passages, feeling our way along walls that were never meant to know the touch of gloved hands or the light of crystal chandeliers. The passage begins, perhaps, behind a section of paneling in the butler's pantry. Panels that look identical to all the others but swing silently open at a touch. The craftsman who created this concealed entrance spent weeks perfecting the mechanism, balancing the weight so precisely that even a child could open it with gentle pressure, while ensuring it remained invisible when closed. The opening reveals not another room, but a narrow corridor that seems to exist in a different world entirely. The walls here are of plain plaster, whitewashed, but never decorated. No ornamental moldings grace these surfaces, no wallpaper patterns distract the eye. The floor is of simple wooden boards, worn smooth by decades of hurrying feet, but never polished to the gleaming perfection demanded in the family quarters. The wood tells stories in its wear patterns, deeper grooves where servants turned corners carrying heavy trays, darker stains where water buckets occasionally sloshed, nail holes where temporary shelving once held supplies for special occasions. Oil lamps in simple brass fittings provide the only light. Gas was too expensive and too dangerous to extend into these utilitarian spaces. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere both intimate and eerie. The air carries a different quality than the perfumed atmosphere of the main house. Cooler, damper, tinged with the sense of cooking and coal smoke and the particular mustiness that comes from spaces where fresh air circulates slowly. Here, the house breathes differently, sighs with different sounds, settles with different rhythms. These passages were not afterthoughts or simple conveniences. They were integral to the architectural conception of the house. Planned with the same care as the grand staircases and reception rooms, architects studied the daily routines of domestic service with scientific precision, mapping the flow of labor through the house, like hydraulic engineers mapping the flow of water through pipes. Every servant's task was analyzed, every movement calculated, every potential encounter between servants and family members eliminated through careful design. The most skilled architects of these hidden worlds came to understand servant work as a kind of choreography. They recognized that a housemaid's daily routine was as complex as any ballet, requiring precise timing, efficient movement patterns, and split-second coordination with other performers. The architecture became the stage for this invisible performance, designed to ensure that the dancers never collided, never appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time, never broke the spell of effortless comfort that the family expected. Follow the passage as it branches and turns, revealing the hidden anatomy of the house. Here, a narrow staircase rises between the walls, its treads designed to muffle footsteps through careful attention to wood grain and construction technique. The stairs are steep and unforgiving, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. But they allow servants to move between floors without ever entering the family's line of sight. Each step was calculated to accommodate the standard stride of a person carrying a loaded tray. The handrail positioned at precisely the height needed for balance, while leaving one hand free for cargo. The engineering of these stairs required extraordinary skill. The risers had to be exactly uniform to prevent stumbling in dim light, the treads deep enough for safety, but not so deep as to waste precious space between walls. The entire structure had to be strong enough to bear constant heavy use while remaining completely silent. Some architects achieved this through double construction, building the visible stairs that the family used with traditional methods, then constructing the hidden stairs as separate structures that touched the house at as few points as possible, minimizing the transmission of sound and vibration. The staircase emerges onto another passage that runs the length of the house's upper floor. Parallel to, but hidden from the main corridor where family bedrooms open onto polished hallways. This hidden corridor represents perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of the concealed architecture, a complete second floor that exists in the shadows of the first, providing access to every room while remaining utterly invisible to the inhabitants. Doors along this hidden corridor provide access to each bedroom through concealed entrances. Panels that appear to be part of the wall's decorative scheme, but open silently to allow servants to tend fires, deliver water, and clean rooms while the family goes about their daily routines. Some of these concealed doors were masterpieces of craftsmanship, incorporating complex mechanical systems that allowed them to be open from either side, while maintaining perfect camouflage when closed. The most elaborate examples included doors that were actually sections of bookcases, complete with false book spines that could be removed and replaced to maintain the illusion. Others were hidden within decorative paneling, their outlines disguised by carved moldings that continued seamlessly across the surface. A few houses featured doors concealed behind mirrors or paintings, operated by hidden switches disguised as decorative elements elsewhere in the room. But perhaps the most mysterious and ingenious element of this hidden infrastructure was the bell system, a network of wires, pulleys, and mechanical linkages that connected every room in the house to the servants' quarters below. This was Victorian engineering at its most sophisticated, requiring the precision of watchmaking applied to the scale of architecture. The system represented thousands of hours of planning, installation, and adjustment, creating a mechanical nervous system that could transmit commands instantly across vast houses. In the family rooms, elegant bell pulls hung beside fireplaces and writing desks, their silk cords and porcelain handles designed to blend seamlessly with the room's decor. These weren't simple rope pulls, but carefully crafted artifacts that reflected the taste and wealth of their owners. The cords might be braided silk in colors that matched the room's palette, ending in handles of carved ivory, crystal, or precious metals. While some incorporated the family coat of arms, others featured delicate painted scenes or intricate metalwork that made them objects of beauty, even as they served utilitarian purposes. But these decorative elements were connected to an elaborate mechanical system that ran through the walls like the nervous system of some vast organism. The engineering required was extraordinary. Wires had to be routed through the house without weakening structural elements. Pulleys had to be positioned to change the direction of force without creating friction that would make the system unreliable. And the entire network had to be adjustable to account for the seasonal expansion and contraction of the building materials. Pull a bell in the morning room, and mechanical energy traveled through a carefully designed network of wires and pivots to ring a corresponding bell in the servants' hall below. The system had to be calibrated so that a gentle pull by a lady in her sitting room would reliably activate the indicator several floors below, while being strong enough to function reliably over years of use. Each bell had its own distinctive tone, a particular pitch and timbre that allowed servants to identify instantly which room required attention. The creation of these distinctive tones required the skills of a bell founder. The library bell might have a deep brass resonance that spoke of scholarly gravity, while the lady's bedroom bell chimed with a higher, more delicate tone that seemed to whisper rather than demand. The nursery bell had its own special sound, urgent enough to ensure quick response to children's needs, but not so harsh as to startle young ears if heard from within the room. But the true genius of the system lay in its visual component. In the servants' hall, a large wooden board displayed rows of small brass indicators, each labeled with the name of a room in careful copperplate script. When a bell was pulled above, the corresponding indicator below would spring into view with a satisfying mechanical click, remaining visible until a servant physically reset it by pulling a small lever. This meant that multiple calls could be tracked simultaneously, priorities established, and no summons forgotten in the rush of daily service. These indicator boards became the command centers of Victorian domestic life. It's important to the smooth running of the household as the bridge of a ship to its navigation. The most elaborate versions included not just room indicators, but also specialized signals. Different positions that could indicate whether the summons was urgent, routine, or required specific preparations. Some houses had systems sophisticated enough to indicate not just which room was calling, but what type of service was required. Imagine standing in that servants' hall during the busy morning hours, watching the indicators dance to life like some mechanical ballet. The cook arrives before dawn to begin preparations for the day's meals. moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, while the rest of the house still sleeps. As the family begins to stir, the board comes alive with the day's first demands. Drawing room appears with a sharp click. Someone wants the fire built up against the morning chill. The indicator trembles slightly as it locks into position, brass catching the lamplight. Master's study follows moments later. Hot water for shaving, fresh linen. Perhaps the morning papers ironed to remove any wrinkles. Blue bedroom joins the growing list of demands. The lady of the house is awake and will require her morning chocolate, her dress laid out, her hair attended to. Each indicator represents a human need, a moment when the invisible machinery of service is called into action. When servants must materialize from their hidden world to meet the requirements of the visible one, the servant assigned to each area knows their indicators by heart, the particular sound each makes when it falls, the exact position it assumes, even the way the brass catches the light differently depending on the angle. As the morning progresses, the dance becomes more complex. Multiple indicators appear simultaneously, requiring careful coordination to ensure efficient service. The head butler or housekeeper orchestrates this invisible symphony, assigning tasks, establishing priorities, ensuring that the elaborate choreography of service proceeds without collision or delay. The acoustic engineering of these houses extended far beyond the bell system, representing some of the most sophisticated sound management of the age. Architects studied the transmission of sound through different materials with the dedication of modern noise pollution specialists. Understanding that the illusion of effortless comfort depended on perfect silence from the service areas, floors and servant areas were designed to minimize creaking through techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern soundproofing. Multiple layers of subflooring created air gaps that dampened sound transmission. Carefully selected wood species provided optimal strength-to-noise ratios. And ingenious construction techniques distributed weight to eliminate the telltale squeaks that might betray a servant's presence. The wood selection alone required expertise that bordered on the mystical. Architects knew that different species aged differently, that grain patterns affected sound transmission, that the time of year when timber was cut could influence its acoustic properties decades later. They specified woods that would remain stable in the varying humidity levels of different parts of the house. Understanding that a floor that stayed silent in the dry warmth of the attic might squeak terribly in the damp coolness of the basement. Doors throughout the service areas were hung on specially designed hinges that opened and closed in absolute silence. These weren't simply wheel-oiled standard hinges, but specially manufactured. Mechanisms that incorporated principles of leverage and counterbalancing to eliminate friction and vibration. Even the selection of wood for these doors was crucial, dense hardwoods that wouldn't warp or shrink, carefully seasoned to eliminate the settling that causes older houses to speak with 100 small voices. The goal was to create a world where 20 or 30 people could live and work in constant motion without creating a single sound that might disturb the tranquility of the floors above. This required not just sophisticated engineering, but a deep understanding of human psychology. Both the psychology of those who demanded silence and those who were required to provide it. Some houses took this acoustic sophistication to almost obsessive levels. Walls between servant areas and family rooms might be double or even triple thickness, filled with sawdust, cork, or other sound-absorbing materials. The space between walls became its own specialized environment, carefully engineered to trap and dissipate sound waves before they could reach the inhabited spaces. Servant staircases were sometimes built as completely separate structures within the main building, connected to but acoustically isolated from the primary architecture. These stairs within stairs required extraordinary engineering skill, as they had to bear the same loads as conventional staircases while transmitting virtually no vibration to the surrounding structure. The most ambitious examples featured servant quarters that were essentially separate buildings constructed within the shells of the main houses. These hidden buildings had their own foundations, their own structural systems, even their own ventilation networks, all designed to ensure that the dozens of people required to maintain Victorian comfort could live and work in complete acoustic isolation from their employers. The question that haunts these hidden passages is this: why did Victorian society invest such enormous resources, financial, technological, and creative, in making essential human labor invisible? The answer reaches into the deepest psychological currents of Victorian life, touching on ideas about class, privacy, and the nature of comfort itself. Part of the explanation lies in the Victorian concept of domestic tranquility, which had evolved far beyond simple comfort into something approaching religious doctrine. The home was seen as a refuge from the increasingly industrial and chaotic outside world, a place where peace and order reigned supreme in conscious opposition to the dirt, noise, and moral ambiguity of urban life. But this tranquility was only possible if the work required to maintain it remained hidden. The sight of servants scrubbing floors, carrying slop buckets, or dealing with the mundane realities of daily maintenance would have shattered the illusion of effortless elegance that Victorian domestic ideals demanded. The home had to appear as a natural state of grace rather than an achieved condition requiring constant human effort. There was also something almost magical about the invisibility of service, something that connected to deeper currents of Victorian imagination and desire. When a fire appeared to tend itself, when rooms seemed to clean themselves, when meals materialized as if summoned by wish alone, the house itself took on an almost supernatural quality. The family became not merely the beneficiaries of human labor, but the masters of an enchanted domain where their desires were fulfilled by invisible forces. This transformation of servants into invisible spirits served a profound psychological need. It allowed Victorian families to enjoy the fruits of others' labor while maintaining the fiction that they were living in a state of natural harmony rather than artificial privilege. The hidden passages enabled them to inhabit a world where comfort appeared to be a birthright, rather than something purchased with others' toil. But perhaps there was something darker at work as well. Psychological need to deny the human cost of comfort that reached beyond mere convenience into the realm of moral self-deception. By rendering servants invisible, Victorian families could enjoy the fruits of others' labor without confronting the reality of that labor. The hidden passages allowed them to maintain the fiction that their comfort was natural rather than purchased, that their leisure was a divine right rather than something made possible by others' sacrifice. This invisibility also served to preserve social hierarchies by making them appear natural and inevitable rather than constructed and maintained. When servants appeared only at the moment of service and disappeared immediately afterward, it became easier to imagine that they existed only in relation to the needs they served, that they had no independent lives, desires, or humanity that might complicate the moral landscape of employment. Walking through these passages today in the few houses where they survive intact feels like moving through a ghost story, but one where the ghosts are not supernatural but historical. The plaster walls still bear the marks of hurrying shoulders, worn smooth in places where countless bodies have brushed against them in narrow corridors. The wooden floors still show the wear patterns of countless footsteps, deeper grooves where servants turned corners under the burden of heavy trays, lighter marks where children ran through passages that served as their unofficial playgrounds. The bell wires still hang slack and silent from their pulleys, their mechanical connections severed by time and abandonment. Some still show the careful labeling that identified their destinations. Faded ink on yellowed paper tags that once meant the difference between prompt service and household disaster. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when old houses settle into evening silence, you can almost hear the echoes of those vanished lives. The whispered conversations between servants coordinating complex tasks, the hurrying footsteps of maids rushing to answer urgent summons, the soft closing of hidden doors as invisible figures moved through their shadow world. In some houses, archaeologists and historians have found evidence of the servants who used these passages, artifacts that bring sudden, startling humanity to spaces designed to deny it. Initials carved into walls speak across the centuries with startling immediacy. Ms. was here 1887. Carved into the plaster of a hidden stairwell, the letters still sharp and defiant after more than a century. Sarah loves John, 1892, scratched into a wooden beam, a moment of personal joy preserved in the utilitarian shadows. A clay pipe, broken and discarded, found under loose floorboards. Evidence of a servant stealing a few moments of personal pleasure in a world where personal time was barely acknowledged to exist. A child's toy, perhaps belonging to a servant's daughter. Discovered in a forgotten corner of a passage that hasn't been opened in decades, its painted features still bright in the darkness where it was dropped by small hands more than a century ago. These artifacts remind us that the hidden architecture was inhabited by real people with real lives, dreams, and disappointments. The passages that seem so mysterious and almost ghostly to us were simply the daily environment for thousands of men and women. who learned to navigate this shadow world with the same familiarity that we bring to our own homes and workplaces. They developed their own geography of these spaces, their own landmarks and shortcuts, their own sense of home within the architecture of invisibility. Some of the most poignant discoveries have been the evidence of human adaptation to these strange living conditions, proof of the irrepressible human tendency to create community and meaning even in spaces designed to deny them. In one house, historians found that servants had created their own system of communication through the passages, scratched marks on walls that indicated which rooms needed attention, small tokens left at strategic points to coordinate complex tasks. Even a primitive but effective system of written messages passed through the network of hidden corridors. These informal communication systems reveal the intelligence and initiative of people who were expected to be merely extensions of their employer's will. They show how servants developed their own technologies of efficiency and cooperation, creating social networks that existed entirely outside the awareness of those they served. The hidden passages became not just routes for service, but spaces of human connection, solidarity, and even resistance. The decline of this elaborate infrastructure began even before the Victorian era ended, undermined by the same social and economic forces that gave Margaret Powell alternatives to domestic service. The Great War accelerated changes that were already underway, drawing millions of people into new forms of work and new social relationships that made the elaborate hierarchies of Victorian domestic service seem increasingly obsolete. Smaller households with fewer servants had no need for elaborate concealment systems. New technologies, electric lighting, central heating, modern plumbing, reduced the amount of labor required to maintain domestic comfort. More importantly, these technologies made it possible for families to maintain comfortable homes without requiring the invisible army of servants that Victorian comfort had demanded. Most decisively, changing social attitudes made the invisibility of service seem less desirable and more morally questionable. The idea that human beings should be hidden away like embarrassing secrets began to feel incompatible with emerging concepts of human dignity and social equality. The architectural elaborate of concealment came to seem not ingenious but shameful. It's not sophisticated but morally primitive. Today, most of these hidden worlds have been forgotten, their entrances sealed, their passages converted to storage space, or simply abandoned to dust and silence. But in the few houses where they remain accessible, they offer a uniquely intimate glimpse into the psychology of a vanished world. A world where comfort and labor existed in separate realms, connected by hidden passages that speak to both the ingenuity and the moral blindness of their creators. These architectural ghosts remind us that every age creates its own forms of invisibility, its own ways of hiding the human costs of comfort and convenience. The specific technologies change, but the psychological mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. The desire to enjoy the benefits of others' labor without confronting the reality of that labor, the tendency to make essential work invisible, the impulse to preserve moral comfort through careful management of what we allow ourselves to see. As we prepare to leave these shadow corridors and return to the light, we might reflect on what they tell us about the true cost of comfort, about the human tendency to make essential labor invisible, and about the elaborate lengths to which people will go to avoid confronting the reality of their dependence on others' work. The hidden passages of Victorian houses are more than architectural curiosities. They're maps of a moral landscape, showing us exactly how one society chose to organize the relationship between comfort and conscience. Let these mysteries settle gently in your mind as we prepare to emerge from the shadows and observe the other side of this hidden world. The lives of those who never needed to use the secret passages, who moved through lighted corridors and slept in warm rooms, blissfully unaware of the elaborate machinery that made their comfort possible, yet somehow complicit in its very invisibility. As we emerge from those hidden passages and secret corridors, blinking in the sudden brightness of gaslight and crystal, let us turn our attention to the other half of this story. The lives that floated above all that invisible labor like ships sailing on an ocean they never thought to examine. Here, in rooms warmed by fires they never lit, served meals they never cooked, surrounded by beauty they never cleaned, lived the families whose comfort was purchased with others' endless toil. But as we settle into this gilded world, remember that we are not here to judge but simply to observe. To understand how wealth and privilege shaped daily existence just as surely as poverty and service shaped the lives we've already explored. The family whose comfort depended on Margaret's labor and countless others like her were themselves bound by invisible chains. Social expectations, rigid protocols, and the exhausting performance of wealth that governed their every waking moment. Picture, if you will, the master bedroom of that same Mayfair townhouse where we began our journey. But now, in the soft light of a winter morning in 1875, sunlight filters through heavy silk curtains, casting everything in a warm golden haze that seems to transform even the most ordinary objects into treasures. The massive four-poster bed, its mahogany frame carved with intricate Victorian flourishes, dominates the room like a temple to comfort and rest. Lady Catherine Whitmore stirs, beneath layers of down-filled comforters and Irish linen sheets so fine they seem to whisper against her skin. Unlike the servants who rose before dawn in rooms where their breath formed clouds, she awakens to a space that has been carefully warmed to the perfect temperature by fires lit hours before, by hands she will never see. The marble fireplace glows with coals arranged just so, the flames dancing behind a brass screen that gleams like captured sunlight. On the bedside table, carved from the same rich mahogany as the bed, stands a delicate porcelain bell pull, its handle painted with tiny roses and connected to that elaborate system of wires and pulleys we explored in the shadow world below. Lady Catherine's fingers, soft from a lifetime of avoiding any rougher contact than silk and velvet, barely need to brush the cord before her lady's maid, Sarah, appears as if by magic through a door concealed in the wallpaper's pattern. Sarah moves with the practiced silence of someone who has learned to be present without intruding, visible without drawing attention to herself. Her own morning began 2 hours earlier in a cramped attic room, but she shows no trace of fatigue as she draws back the heavy curtains with movements as choreographed as a ballet. The winter morning floods the room with pale light that catches the gold threads woven into the wallpaper, the silver brushes arranged on the dressing table, the crystal bottles that hold perfumes imported from Paris. "Good morning, my lady," Sarah murmurs, her voice carefully modulated to the perfect tone, respectful but not obsequious, warm but not familiar. She has already laid out Lady Catherine's morning dress, a creation of burgundy silk with jet buttons that required 3 seamstresses a week to complete. The underthings are of the finest cotton and silk, edged with lace made by nuns in a Belgian convent, each piece an artwork of needlework that costs more than most working families earned in a month. Lady Catherine's morning toilet is a ritual as elaborate as any religious ceremony. Warm water, heated in the kitchen and carried up the hidden stairs by invisible hands, fills a marble basin painted with scenes of pastoral bliss. The soap, milled in France and scented with lavender from Provence, creates a lather as soft as silk against skin that has never known harsh weather or rough work. Sarah's hands move with practiced efficiency as she tends to her mistress's needs, brushing hair that gleams like polished mahogany, arranging it in the elaborate style currently fashionable in London society, securing it with combs made from tortoise shell and decorated with seed pearls. The dressing ritual reveals the extraordinary complexity that wealth could impose on the simplest activities. Lady Catherine's corset, a marvel of whalebone and silk, requires 2 people to lace properly, Sarah pulling and adjusting until her mistress's waist achieves the fashionable hourglass silhouette that Victorian society demanded. Over this foundation comes a chemise, then a camisole, then the elaborate construction of petticoats and bustles that create the architectural foundation for the dress itself. Each layer serves not just fashion, but social communication. The quality of the lace, the cut of the fabric, the style of the buttons, all speak in a visual language that other members of society can read as clearly as words on a page. Lady Catherine's morning dress announces her status as precisely as if she wore a uniform. Its every detail calculated to maintain her position in the intricate hierarchy of London's social elite. As Sarah fastens the final buttons, Lady Catherine examines herself in a mirror that reflects not just her physical appearance, but the successful performance of wealth and position. The woman looking back is the product of not just genes and fortune, but of an entire system of labor and consumption that extends from the silkworms of China to the seamstresses of London, from the pearl divers of the South Pacific to the lady's maid who now steps back with the satisfaction of artistic work completed. Breakfast awaits in the morning room, a chamber painted in cheerful yellow and furnished with pieces that combine comfort with careful display of taste and wealth. It's a table, set with china so delicate it seems to glow with inner light. Bears a meal that represents hours of labor by people Lady Catherine will never meet. Fresh bread, baked before dawn by the kitchen maid we met earlier, sits alongside butter churned from cream so fresh it still carries the sweetness of summer grass. Eggs cooked to absolute perfection nest in silver egg cups that require daily polishing to maintain their mirror finish. The tea service alone represents a small fortune, complete set of bone china painted with scenes of English countryside. Each piece fired in the kilns of Staffordshire and transported to London with the care usually reserved for religious relics. The tea itself has traveled from plantations in Ceylon and India, selected by experts who can distinguish between dozens of subtle varieties, blended to create the perfect balance of strength and delicacy that marks a truly refined household. Lord Whitmore joins his wife for breakfast, his own morning preparations having followed a similarly elaborate ritual in his dressing room. His clothes, tailored on Savile Row by craftsmen who learned their trade from masters, fit his form with the precision of sculpture. The fabric, wool so fine it feels like silk, was woven in mills where workers labored in conditions that would have horrified the man now wearing their product. His boots, polished to a mirror finish by invisible hands, reflect the morning light like black marble. Their conversation over breakfast illustrates the particular concerns of their social stratum. Lord Whitmore discusses his investments, railway shares that have performed well, concerns about manufacturing in the north, plans for a new wing on their country estate. Lady Catherine mentions social obligations, calling cards that must be returned, dinner parties that require careful orchestration, the delicate navigation of London society's unwritten rules and shifting alliances. Neither speaks of the 37 people who work in their various households, whose labor makes this leisurely breakfast possible. The servants exist in their consciousness like the gas that lights their lamps or the coal that heats their rooms, essential but invisible, present but unacknowledged, their humanity somehow filtered out by the very completeness of their service. After breakfast, Lady Catherine's day unfolds in a series of activities that would exhaust a laborer while appearing to involve no labor at all. Morning calls must be paid, the elaborate social ritual by which London's upper classes maintain their networks of relationship and influence. These visits, seemingly casual, actually followed rules as rigid as court protocol. The timing of arrivals, the duration of stays, the topics of conversation, all were governed by conventions that took years to master and a lifetime to navigate successfully. The preparation for morning calls requires its own elaborate ritual. The carriage must be ordered, a gleaming black broom maintained by stable boys who rise before dawn to feed and groom the horses. To polish the brass fittings, to ensure that every spoke and spring functions with mechanical perfection. The coachman and footman must be dressed in livery that marks their employer's status as clearly as heraldic banners, their appearance a reflection of the family's taste and wealth. Lady Catherine's calling costume represents another small fortune in fabric and labor. The dress, cut in the latest fashion, is accompanied by gloves that fit like second skin, a hat decorated with feathers from exotic birds, and a fur muff that required the pelts of dozens of small animals. Each accessory has been selected not just for beauty, but for its ability to communicate wealth, taste, and social position to anyone capable of reading these subtle signals. The morning calls themselves unfold in drawing rooms that represent the pinnacle of Victorian decorative arts. Persian carpets cover floors of polished oak, their intricate patterns telling stories of distant lands and ancient crafts. Furniture carved by master craftsmen supports fabrics woven with threads of gold and silver. Paintings in elaborate gold frames depict landscapes and portraits that cost fortunes to commission and maintain. In these perfumed chambers, surrounded by beauty that most people see only in museums, Lady Catherine and her peers engage in conversations that seem almost choreographed in their adherence to unwritten rules. Political topics are discussed with careful indirection, social gossip is shared with calculated precision, and business matters are approached through elaborate euphemisms that preserve the fiction that such practical concerns are beneath the notice of true ladies and gentlemen. The lunch that follows these morning exertions is itself a marvel of culinary art. Multiple courses arrive in perfect sequence, each dish a masterpiece of flavor and presentation that required hours of preparation by skilled cooks working in kitchens that most diners never see. The wine selected from cellars that represent decades of careful acquisition. complements each course with the precision of a musical composition. The afternoon brings its own rituals and obligations. Perhaps there is shopping to be done, not the hurried gathering of necessities that occupies most people, but the leisurely examination of luxuries and establishments that cater exclusively to those for whom price is no object. The finest silk merchants, jewelers, whose creations grace royalty, dressmakers whose waiting lists stretch for months, all compete for the attention and patronage of women like Lady Catherine, whose approval can make or break a business. Or perhaps the afternoon calls for entertainment. A private concert in a drawing room where professional musicians perform for audiences of 20. Their art appreciated by people whose education has trained them to recognize subtleties of technique and interpretation that escape ordinary listeners. The musicians themselves live precarious lives, dependent on the whims and taste of patrons whose wealth allows them to support or destroy careers with a word. The elaborate ritual of afternoon tea provides another opportunity for social display and connection. The tea service, silver that requires daily attention from servants who polish each piece to mere brightness, supports china so delicate that it seems almost ethereal. Tiny sandwiches cut into perfect triangles with crusts removed, contain ingredients that traveled from across the empire to reach this table. Pastries created by master bakers require techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen who never taste the final products themselves. As evening approaches, the real performance of wealth begins. Dinner in a house like the Whitmores is not merely a meal, but a theatrical production requiring a cast of dozens. The dining room, illuminated by gas chandeliers that cast dancing shadows on silk wallpaper, becomes a stage where wealth and taste are displayed with military precision. The table setting alone represents a fortune in precious metals and fine china. Each place setting includes multiple forks, knives, and spoons, each piece designed for specific courses. Their use governed by rules that mark the difference between the truly refined and those who merely aspire to refinement. Crystal glasses, blown by master craftsmen in Venice, catch and refract the gaslight into tiny rainbows. Flowers arranged by hands that rose before dawn fill the air with perfumes that compete with the scents of elaborate dishes prepared in kitchens that exist in a different world entirely. The meal itself unfolds like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Course follows course in precise sequence. Clear soups that required hours of careful simmering. Fish prepared with techniques that represent centuries of culinary evolution. Roasted meats that showcase the skills of master butchers and cooks. Each dish is served by footmen, whose white gloves and silent movements create the illusion that food appears and disappears through some form of benevolent magic. The conversation that accompanies this feast reveals the particular concerns and blindnesses of extreme wealth. Business ventures are discussed as if they were games, their human consequences filtered through layers of abstraction and euphemism. Political questions are approached with the detachment of people whose comfort insulates them from the practical effects of policy. Social questions, the servant problem, the challenges of maintaining multiple households, the difficulties of finding reliable people, are addressed with the same tone used to discuss bad weather or other minor inconveniences. After dinner, as the women retire to the drawing room and the men to the library for brandy and cigars, the house settles into its evening rhythm. But even this relaxation requires constant and visible support. Fires must be tended, candles replaced, rooms prepared for the night. The family's leisure rests on a foundation of others' labor that continues long after the last guest has departed. Lady Catherine's retirement to her bedroom reverses the morning's ritual of dressing. Sarah reappears to help remove the elaborate costume of wealth and status, each layer carefully preserved for future use or cleaning. The corset's constriction gives way to the softness of silk nightgowns. Hair is brushed with silver-backed brushes until it gleams, then braided with ribbons that cost more than most people's weekly wages. The bed that receives her, warmed by brass warming pans filled with hot coals and carried up hidden stairs by invisible hands, offers comfort that most people in 1875 cannot even imagine. Down pillows soft as clouds, linen sheets woven with thread counts that represent the pinnacle of textile art, blankets of wool so fine it feels like silk, all combine to create a sleeping environment as carefully engineered as any modern luxury. As Lady Catherine drifts toward sleep, surrounded by beauty and comfort that represent the labor of hundreds of people she will never know, Her last conscious thoughts might turn to tomorrow's obligations, social calls to be returned, correspondence to be answered, the endless, exhausting performance of wealth and status that governs every moment of her waking life. But in the quiet darkness, as the house settles around her and the servants below stairs finally find their own rest in narrow beds under thin blankets, the true nature of her comfort becomes visible. Every thread in her silk nightgown, every feather in her down pillows, every degree of warmth in her perfectly heated room has been paid for, not just with money, but with human labor and human sacrifice that she has been carefully trained never to see. The gilded mirror of Victorian upper-class life reflected beauty and comfort and ease, but it was a mirror that showed only half the truth. Behind its silver surface lay the shadow world we have explored, the hidden passages, the invisible labor, the human cost of comfort that polite society agreed to ignore. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin again. Fires lit by hands reddened with cold, water carried by aching arms, meals prepared by people who will never taste them. The performance of wealth and leisure will continue its elaborate dance, supported by the hidden choreography of service that makes such performances possible. As we prepare to step back from this world of silk and gaslight, of comfort purchased with others' labor, we might reflect on how little, in some ways, has truly changed. The forms of our comfort may be different, the sources of our labor more distant and abstract, but the fundamental relationship between privilege and service, between visibility and invisibility, between those who rest and those who work through the night to make that rest possible. These relationships continue to shape our world in ways we may be as blind to as Lady Catherine was to the lives that surrounded and supported her own. Let this understanding settle gently in your mind as we prepare to bring our journey through the hidden world of Victorian service to its quiet conclusion, carrying with us a deeper appreciation for the human cost of comfort and the dignity of those who labor in the shadows to light others' days. And so, as the gaslight dims and the last echoes of those hidden footsteps fade into memory, we find ourselves here in the gentle darkness of our own time, carrying with us the stories of lives lived in service and shadow, in silk and in soot, in the visible world of comfort and the invisible world that made such comfort possible. How strange it is to think that just over a century ago, the simple act of waking to a warm room required someone else to rise in the cold darkness hours before dawn. That the morning tea you might sip while listening to these words would have represented the labor of dozens of hands. From the servants who lit the fires and boiled the water, to the workers in distant plantations whose lives we never glimpsed, to the ship's crews who carried those precious leaves across oceans we can barely imagine. Tonight, as you settle deeper into whatever comfort surrounds you, perhaps a bed warmed by central heating that turns on with the simple touch of a thermostat, perhaps blankets washed by machines that require only the pressing of buttons, perhaps in a room lit by electricity that flows through wires as invisible as those Victorian bell pulls, but infinitely more democratic in their reach. You are the beneficiary of a quiet revolution that transformed not just how we live, but how we understand the relationship between comfort and labor. The world we have visited tonight, that gaslit realm of hidden passages and invisible hands, vanished not through sudden catastrophe but through the gentle erosion of countless small changes. Electric lights eliminated the need for servants to trim wicks and fill oil lamps. Central heating made it unnecessary for someone to rise before dawn to light fires in every room. Labor-saving devices in kitchens meant that elaborate meals could be prepared by fewer hands. Telephones replaced the networks of personal messengers who once carried communications across the city. But perhaps more importantly, the very idea that human beings should remain invisible while providing essential services began to seem not just impractical, but morally troubling. The same social currents that gave Margaret Powell alternatives to domestic service also challenged the assumption that some people existed primarily to serve others' comfort. The elaborate architecture of concealment, those hidden passages and secret stairs, began to seem like monuments to a kind of blindness that an increasingly democratic world could no longer sustain. Margaret herself lived to see this transformation. Writing her memoirs in a world where the rigid hierarchy of upstairs and downstairs had largely dissolved, the young woman who once scrubbed pots with raw hands in a basement scullery lived to see her own children enjoy opportunities that would have been unimaginable in her youth. Her story reminds us that history is not just the grand sweep of political events and famous personalities, but the accumulation of individual lives lived with dignity and determination, even under circumstances designed to diminish both. The hidden passages she navigated still exist in some of the great houses that survived from her era, but they are silent now, their bell wires slack, their narrow stairs gathering dust. Walking through them today feels like exploring the ruins of a vanished civilization. It's one that existed not in some distant land, but parallel to and hidden within the world we think we know. The scratched initials on plaster walls, the worn patches on wooden floors, the faded numbers above forgotten doorways, all speak to lives that were fully human, fully complex, fully deserving of recognition. Even when the world around them insisted on their invisibility, Lady Catherine and her world of silk and gaslight vanished too, though more gradually and perhaps less completely. The great townhouses were sold or converted into flats. The elaborate rituals of calling and dining gave way to simpler customs better suited to a world where fewer hands were available to maintain such elaborate performances. The crystal and silver were dispersed to auction houses and museums, where they now serve as artifacts of a way of life that required dozens of people to sustain a few people's comfort. Yet something of that world persists, not in its forms, but in its essential relationships. Our comfort still depends on labor we rarely see, performed by people whose names we rarely know. The hands that harvest our food, manufacture our clothes, clean our offices, maintain our infrastructure, remain as invisible to most of us as Victorian servants were to their employers. The technology has changed, the scale has shifted, but the basic equation, comfort for some based on labor by others, continues to shape our world in ways we may be as unconscious of as the Victorians were of theirs. The mystery of those hidden passages, those elaborate bell systems, those architectural conspiracies of concealment ultimately reveal something profound about the human capacity for both creativity and blindness. The same intelligence that could design such ingenious solutions to practical problems, that could engineer silence into floors and walls, that could create mechanical networks of astonishing complexity. That same intelligence somehow failed to see the full humanity of the people for whom these systems were designed. But perhaps that is too harsh a judgment for people who lived within the constraints of their own time and place. Perhaps every age has its own forms of necessary blindness, its own elaborate mechanisms for avoiding uncomfortable truths about the cost of comfort. The Victorian obsession with hiding the labor that made their lives possible may seem obvious to us now, but what forms of essential work do we make invisible? What modern equivalents of hidden passages allow us to enjoy comfort without confronting its true cost? These are questions for daylight hours, for the active mind engaged with the challenges of living consciously in a complex world. But here in the darkness, as our journey through the shadow world of Victorian service draws to its close, perhaps it is enough to carry with us a deeper appreciation for the human hands that have always worked to make life more comfortable, more beautiful, more livable for others. The servants who rose before dawn to light fires, who scrubbed floors until their knees bled, who polished silver until it gleamed like moonlight, who learned to move through great houses like benevolent ghosts. They were not just historical curiosities or sociological specimens. They were people like us, with their own dreams and disappointments, their own moments of joy and sorrow, their own ways of finding meaning and dignity in circumstances that often seem designed to deny both. Margaret Powell's journey from frightened kitchen maid to confident author reminds us that no social system, however rigid, can completely contain the human spirit. Her story, and the stories of countless others like her, speaks to something indestructible in human nature, the capacity to grow, to adapt, to find ways forward even when the path seems blocked by circumstances beyond individual control. And Lady Catherine, surrounded by beauty that required others' labor to maintain, trapped in her own elaborate performance of wealth and status, reminds us that privilege brings its own forms of blindness and constraint. Her comfort was real, but so was her isolation from the full spectrum of human experience. Her ease was purchased not just with money, but with a kind of voluntary ignorance that impoverished her understanding of the world she inhabited. As you settle deeper into sleep, let these stories blend and merge in your consciousness like watercolors running together on wet paper. The narrow attic rooms and the silk-draped bedchambers, the hidden passages and the gaslit drawing rooms, the roughened hands and the soft gloves, the early rising and the leisured waking, all part of the same human story. All reflections of our endless attempts to create comfort and meaning in a world that offers no guarantees of either. The gentle revolution of time has transformed the forms of our comfort, but not its essential nature. We still depend on each other, still participate in networks of interdependence that span the globe, still benefit from labor we rarely see and services we often take for granted. The difference is that we have perhaps slightly better tools for seeing these connections, slightly more democratic ways of organizing the relationships between work and comfort, slightly more conscious choices about how to live with awareness of our dependence on others' efforts. The night that surrounds you now is different from the nights that surrounded Margaret in her narrow attic bed or Lady Catherine in her down-filled luxury. Electric lights have banished the particular quality of darkness that once made candles and oil lamps precious. Central heating has eliminated the sharp cold that once made the difference between upstairs and downstairs a matter of physical as well as social comfort. Modern conveniences have democratized many forms of ease that were once available only to those who could command others' labor. But the night itself remains unchanged, the same darkness that calls us to rest, the same quiet that invites reflection, the same mystery that surrounds the transition from waking consciousness to the deeper mysteries of sleep and dream. In this darkness, the distinctions between upstairs and downstairs, between visible and invisible, between comfortable and constrained, begin to fade into something more fundamental: our shared humanity, our common need for rest and peace, our universal participation in the ancient rhythms that govern all human life. Let the stories you have heard tonight settle into your memory like silt settling on a riverbed, enriching the soil from which understanding grows. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to see more clearly the connections between comfort and labor, between privilege and responsibility, between the visible surface of life and the hidden networks of work and care that make such surface beauty possible. But that is tomorrow's work. Tonight, it is enough to rest in the knowledge that human beings have always found ways to care for each other, to create beauty in difficult circumstances, to maintain dignity even when the world seems determined to diminish it. The servants who worked in shadow and the families who lived in light were all part of the same human story, one that continues to unfold, continues to evolve, continues to offer opportunities for greater consciousness and deeper compassion. Close your eyes now and let yourself drift into the peace that comes from understanding. Understanding that comfort has always required cooperation, that ease has always depended on effort, that the luxury of rest has always been supported by the willingness of others to work while we sleep. May your rest tonight be enriched by gratitude for all the visible and invisible hands that have made it possible. May you wake tomorrow with eyes slightly more open to the networks of care and labor that surround and support every moment of our lives. In the quiet darkness, as the last echoes of Victorian footsteps fade into memory, let sleep come gently, carrying you toward dreams where the boundaries between server and served dissolve into the deeper truth of our shared humanity, our common need for rest, our universal dependence on each other's labor and care. The hidden passages of the past have taught us their secrets. Now let the gentle passage of night carry you toward the renewal that comes with dawn, toward the fresh opportunities for awareness and appreciation that each new day brings. Sleep well, and let the quiet wisdom of those who worked in shadow guide you toward dreams of a world where essential labor is honored, where comfort is shared more equitably, and where the full humanity of every person who contributes to our collective well-being is seen, acknowledged, and celebrated in the light of day.